Hello, my name is John Kuhl, and I'm with the Congressional Youth Leadership Council. We have 18 of our students here today for a conversation with a team of congressional experts. Today's webcast will focus on the relationship between the Senate and the House. This is especially timely given Sunday's vote by the House to pass the Senate's version of health care reform. Our students will ask questions about how the two chambers interact, how a filibuster works, and whether the two chambers still meet the vision our founding fathers had for a bicameral legislature. This is the fifth in a series of webcasts that are produced by the Civics Connection, a joint project by the Frey Institute for Government and the University of Central Florida and the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. These webcasts are made possible via a grant from the U.S. Department of Education and are meant to enable high school students to learn more about their government by asking questions of former legislators and other congressional experts. We are joined by Congresswoman Connie Morella, who represented Maryland in the House from 1987 until 2003, and by Marty Gold, whose long career in the Senate includes serving as floor advisor to then Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist. Let me give each of them a quick chance to introduce themselves, and then we'll open up the floor for questions. Why don't we begin with you, Congresswoman?
Yeah. Oh, I'm Connie Morella, and I approve this message. That sounds pretty familiar, doesn't it, in this format? I want to congratulate you for being chosen the National Youth Leadership Conference attendees, and tell you I'm very happy to be here with you and with a dear friend of mine, too, Martin Gold. Okay, what about me? I am an educator. I taught at the community college. I was elected to the state legislature of Maryland because I wanted to make things happen. I felt I had to have a place at the table to do that. I was then elected to the federal Congress in 1987 and served there for 16 years. And then I was appointed by the president to become ambassador to OECD. A lot of letters, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, and it came from the Marshall Plan, which brought the European countries together after World War II. And now I'm a former, and doing a little bit of teaching at one of the universities and involved with the former members of Congress and trying to inspire young people to public service.
Great. Okay, Mr. Gold.
Thank you, and I'm Marty Gold, and I have been in Washington quite some time, former resident of Montgomery County, Maryland, and proudly one of Connie Morella's supporters. I came here because I had an interest in politics and government, came to American University here in this city, began working in political campaigns almost as soon as I started in 1964 in Maryland, and then on Capitol Hill as a volunteer in 1967 and stayed there for a long, long time. So I worked for Mark Hatfield of Oregon, Senator, as well as Howard Baker of Tennessee, then the Minority Leader and then Majority Leader. Left Senate employment in 1982 and went to the private sector representing clients for 20 years. Came back to the Hill in 2003 at the request of Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist to help him in his first year as leader, and then returned to the private sector. But I've observed this process for 45 years, loving just about every minute of it, win or lose some legislative battles, but loving every minute of it because I think it's a thing of great beauty to watch the Constitution work and the government work.
All right, thank you.
You know, the staff was so important. He mentioned he was a key staffer for so many very prominent people who moved things. I used to say, a paraphrase of the 23rd Psalm, my rod and my staff, they comfort me, they prepare the papers for me in the presence of my constituents. So it shows how important staff are.
All right, we've divided our conversation up into three topics, and the first is about how the House and Senate work together when they pass legislation. So why don't we go ahead and take our first question.
Good evening. My name is Shama Dalje, and I'm from Florida. And my question is, both House and Senate have committees. What's the process in the name of this or these committees to solve the conflicts between the House and the Senate if they have the same bill but kind of different, but it sort of said the same thing?
So how does the reconciliation process work?
Mm-hmm. Well, you know, George Washington, when he looked at both chambers, he said, you know, the Senate is the saucer to the cup, because what it does is it catches the the passionate flames of exuberance that come from the House. So it's like the House is the one for action and the Senate is the one for contemplation. What happens when the two houses don't agree? Well, in traditional times, and not this time of reconciliation, it would go to a conference. And you would have your leaders from the Senate on that piece of legislation, the leaders in the House, trying to work together to resolve it. And then, of course, it would go through the process of going through the Rules Committee before it goes out on the House floor, the Senate floor, and before it goes to the President's office. But now this reconciliation is different, and it has to do with filibuster. Do you want me to go into that, or should I let?
We're going to get to the filibuster part in just a little bit, but if
Right.
either of you want to expand.
Well, so at any rate, at this point, what both houses do when they disagree is they come out with a conference committee. The conference committee tries to resolve the differences, and then again it would go to each chamber to be voted on. It's that wonderful balance of power between the two houses, the House of Representatives, which represents the population of states, and the Senate, which is equal for every state.
So, Mr. Gold, if the House and the Senate both pass a bill, they create this conference committee. So who's on the committee?
Well, conference committees are really a very traditional mechanism of resolving differences between the House and the Senate on major bills. And who would be on the conference committee? Typically, it would be senior members of both parties from the jurisdictional committees. So, for example, if the bill regarded patent law, then the Judiciary Committee in the House and the Judiciary Committee in the Senate would be the jurisdictional committees, and the legislation would be composed, or the conference, would be composed of the experts on that legislation coming from the jurisdictional committees. When they would report out their compromise, they call it a conference report, and both houses have to act identically on the same piece of legislation before the legislation can go to the President. So the compromise would be reported out. It would go first to one house and then to the other. When both houses agree to the conference report, that means they're agreeing to the compromise, and then the measure is ready to go down to the President. That is the traditional way of resolving differences, but it's not the only way of doing it, because sometimes the conferences don't exist at all, as has happened more in this Congress, and legislation just gets bounced back and forth between the House and the Senate in sort of a ping-pong game, until finally you get both houses acting the same way on the same piece of legislation. But either way, they both have to act the same, and then it can go down to the White House.
All right, thank you. Next question.
Yes, thank you. Hi, my name is Emily Grimm, and I'm from Illinois. And my question is, it seems as though lately, no matter what one party views, it is automatic that the opposite party will have the opposite opinion, and it's almost on purpose. Is this conflicting with how the chambers are interacting?
Do you want me to start?
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Well, I think it's good to have differences of opinion. But what is important is that the people get together to discuss why they differ, what their attitude is, so that something can be worked out. I think the key to good legislation is the key to good diplomacy, and that is to listen, to learn, to respect the other person's point of view, and then to come out with what is in the best interests of the country. Hopefully that's done, but unfortunately what you've seen, as you read the papers, you've seen an enhanced polarization that's taken place, where it's almost like the two sides don't want to come together to listen to each other. And so I hope that we will see a reemergence of what did happen, or at least happen more than now, of both parties respecting the fact that there will be differences, but there will be agreement. You saw that with civil rights legislation, you saw it with transportation legislation, you saw it with a lot of our key pieces of legislation that both parties came together for a good resolution.
I think that the polarization is a process that has been ongoing now for some time. The polarization has been absolute on the health care bill, or nearly absolute, in the sense that every member of the minority party in both chambers opposed the bill. So, along with some members of the majority party in the House of Representatives and a small smattering of people, but basically it's going to be a polarized bill. But that okay, is the symptom, not the disease. The disease is that the polarization that has been going on in American politics is reflected in the American Congress. When people lament what the Congress looks like, my general view of it is the Congress is a very good reflection of the politics of the country. Now, in the House of Representatives, and I say this as a Senate person, in the House of Representatives, the institution tends to have rules and procedures and mechanisms that help to fuel that kind of polarization. In the Senate, for reasons that the Congresswoman just enunciated, it's different. In the Senate, it's not really built so much for that kind of polarization. And normally you have the minority exercising substantial power in the Senate to force the kind of legislative consensus and mainstream legislation. That's the cooling action of the saucer that she was talking about. This budget reconciliation process is going on now in the Senate is a way to try to avoid that outcome. But in general terms, the Senate is a way to try to build back some of the consensus that polarization tends to break apart. So it is a real problem, I think, in American politics, reflected in the American Congress, and it puts a lot of strain on the Congress.
You know, there was an editorial in the Washington Post, and they came out in favor of the health care bill. They said, however, the big problem is the two sides did not work together. And they went into some reasons why. Had they brought Republicans in at the beginning, there were some issues that Republicans had articulated that would have enhanced and made the bill better, like some malpractice reform and a number of other areas. So they've lost something by virtue of not having any coming together on that particular bill. And I hope in the future that won't be the case on immigration, trade, and other
issues,
policies.
right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next question.
Hello, my name is Andy Baxter from Franklin, Texas. In the recent healthcare debate, the two chambers have not yet agreed on the amendments to the bill, yet the bill has already been sent to the president and has been signed. Do you feel that both chambers should have to agree upon a bill before the president has a chance to sign it?
He'll sign again. I mean, yes, they're going to have to agree on the amendments that are coming from the Senate. And that's a lot of trust. It's a lot of trust because many people voted for the bill knowing that there were going to be amendments that they liked, they had been promised. And so the trust factor is there. Will these be the amendments that they had expected would be there? And then the president will sign that final reconciliation bill. It's a kind of a crazy method, and it's the Senate rule. You know, both the House and the Senate come up with their own rules, and the Senate has this rule with regard to filibuster. But that has really kind of changed. It used to be that a filibuster was that you just kept talking to prevent voting on a particular bill that you didn't like. And there was an old movie, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Jimmy Stewart, and Jimmy Stewart was filibustering a bill on the floor of the, I guess it's on the floor of the Senate, and he never stopped talking on and on and on so he could prevent the voting. And then, as a matter of fact, in 1957, I was noting this recently, 1957, Senator Strom Thurmond from South Carolina continued with that talking on the floor, never stopping. And I think he set a record of 24 hours, 18 minutes. And what he had done, this is what I read, what he had done to allow himself to be on the floor that long is he had gone to a salon to be dehydrated so he wouldn't have to go to the bathroom. And that was true, right?
That's exactly
and then
right.
in 1975, they changed it so you didn't have to be talking on the floor, and you could just, 41 votes could say, well, this is not going to come before us to even be voted on, and the other party would need the 60 votes, and that was the big impasse, trying to get 60 votes to put as a cloture rule to stop the debate or stop the cessation of the bill coming before the Senate.
What I have told students for many years about that 24-hour and 18-minute speech is that at the time that Senator Thurmond made the speech, he was 55 years old, and he lived to be 100. proving that filibustering is not bad for your health.
Just the health of everybody
Yeah,
else.
just help everybody else. You know, I want to say one thing to you about the budget reconciliation, because it is an unorthodox situation. The answer to your question is sure, both houses have to agree before it goes to the president. They really should be acting on one piece of legislation. There is a very specific reason why that is not the case on health care reform, and it goes like this. The Massachusetts election of January the 19th, 2010. If Martha Coakley wins the election in Massachusetts, then Democrats will have 60 votes in the Senate. House members are not happy with the Senate Christmas Eve passed bill. So when it goes back over to the House will make some changes in that bill pursuant to some sort of a bicameral, not a bipartisan, but a bicameral agreement between Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader Reid and others. The House amendments will get put on, goes back over to the Senate to seek Senate agreement. The Senate agrees, and they're done on one piece of legislation. But because Scott Brown won the election, and therefore there is no longer a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate, the concern was that if the House amended the Senate Christmas Eve bill, the bill would be filibustered in the Senate and would never pass. So they had to break it apart into two vehicles. The House had to take up the changes it wanted in a separate vehicle and run it through the budget reconciliation process, which is an expedited means essentially to avoid the filibuster and work around the outcome of the election. So that's why it went under two bills rather than one bill. But that process is quite unorthodox. It's not illegal, it's just unorthodox, but it's really geared to the specifics of this situation. It is not the kind of thing that normally would happen.
You know, the problem with that is even if Martha Coakley had won in Massachusetts and they had the 60 votes in the Senate, is there's not really an opportunity in this environment for a senator to say, oh, but I don't want this to come up either. In other words, it is more and more difficult because of the polarization for somebody to vote out of the box, away from their party. I mean, right now in the Congress of the United States, you have on the House side, you have what we call blue dogs. Blue dogs were those Democrats elected from traditionally Republican seats, and they do not always vote party line. In the House, in the Republican side, you used to have moderate Republicans. There are fewer and fewer now, again, who would vote differently from the rest of their party. But now you're reaching the point where we're almost counting on the fact that, well, yeah, everybody is going to be in line. Nobody is going to jump out and say, I disagree. And I don't think that's good. So you'll all change it someday, right? You're going to run for Congress and, yeah.
And the election we were talking about was after Senator Ted Kennedy, who was a
Died,
Democrat,
yes.
died.
Right,
There was
thank
a
you.
special election, and then Scott Brown, the Republican, won.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, next question.
Thank you.
We're going to move on. Actually, we've been talking a little bit about the filibuster. Now we're going to get more in depth on that.
Hi, my name's April Browski, and I'm from Massachusetts. And my
Oh,
question
from
is,
Massachusetts, where they
Yeah.
have health care by
yes,
legislation, sure.
what's the point of a filibuster, and are they still needed?
Good question.
Should I take that?
Sure.
No. The point is the point that the Congresswoman made about the saucer cooling the passions. Look, in the final analysis, the Senate is not the House. It was never designed to be the House. You start with the fact that you have 2 senators per state, so that the least populated state, Wyoming, has as many senators as the most populated state, California. You start with the fact that the terms are split up so that you only have a third of the Senate up at any time, so that even if the public begins to get into a wave election, the whole of the Senate is not exposed. You start with that fact. You start with the fact that in the very first place, senators didn't even represent the public directly, but were elected by state legislators, which is something that many people do not know. So essentially, they served a different purpose in the first place under the Constitution, because their object was to represent the states rather than people. The Senate is a different kind of institution, and the rules that grew up in the Senate, which were not actually imposed by the way of by the framers of the Constitution, but rather by the first senators, but the framers empowered them to do this. Those rules essentially said that the Senate was not going to operate like the House. It would be a place of greater deliberation, and it would be a place where individual senators and minority parties and minority coalitions, even bipartisan minority coalitions, could have substantial force in order to force more consensus legislation. Filibustering began in the Senate as a tactic in about the 1840s. They didn't even have a mechanism to shut it down until 1917. So right now, in order to get cloture, which is the mechanism by which you end the filibuster, you've got to get 60. What that means is that you have to have some level of bipartisan consensus unless you have a filibuster-proof Senate, which briefly did exist in this Congress. But otherwise, you've got to get some kind of bipartisan consensus. And one party cannot just ram things through. I have lived to see Republican majorities and Democratic minorities and Democratic majorities and Republican minorities. And I know that people from both parties have very effectively used the filibuster either to do one of two things: to moderate legislation that they found otherwise unacceptable, or to block legislation that they could not stand. And it has served, I think, the constitutional purpose brilliantly, to tell you the truth, and ought not to be modified.
There is an attempt to modify it because, again, public don't like the idea that you're going through this mechanism when 51 votes should be able to make a difference in something passing. But the legislation is not going to go anyplace. It's not going to go anyplace because it has been, as Martin said, it has been used by both sides. I mean, Vice President Biden, it was quoted in an article, something he said earlier when the Democrats were in the minority, about the fact that he thought that there should be, that it was a good thing to have the filibuster. It helps the minority. It helps the minority. He has subsequently changed his mind, obviously, as has the majority party in toto. In order to, people have often said, well, how do you change it? Why do we need this? Why can't they change their rules? Well, with the Senate, you've got 1/3 who are up for election every election, since they have 6-year terms. And in order to change it, they would need 67 votes to change that rule. And so I don't think they're going to get that. And I don't think they want to. I think if they talk about it, it sounds like good rhetoric for the constituents.
If I might just tell you a very fast story. When I worked for Howard Baker, he was in the minority as the minority leader, and then he got elected majority leader. And I had watched as the previous majority leader, Robert Byrd, at the beginning of every Congress proposed some rules changes.
Right.
So when Baker became the leader, I thought, as a good staffer, that's what I ought to do. I ought to write up a list of proposed rules changes and present them to him to see whether or not he wanted to offer them up to the Democrats. So I did this. And Baker asked me to do one thing before we took them to the Democrats, and that was to take them to Senator Helms, Jesse Helms of North Carolina. The bottom line of the story is we never presented them to the Democrats because we never got them past Senator Helms. And his position was very simple. We just came out of the minority, and we'll be in the minority again someday. And we need the protections. So when Howard Baker was the leader, he made no changes in the Senate rules. It is very much a question of where you sit depends on where you stand, where right? Or where you stand depends on where you sit, that's what I want to say. In other words, if you sit in the minority, you value those rules. If you sit in the majority, the rules are very inconvenient. But the bottom line of it is it does serve that constitutional purpose of the framers. The Articles of Confederation involved a unicameral legislature in Congress. When they wrote the Constitution, they made it a bicameral legislature. They did not make it a bicameral legislature so that the Senate would be a miniature house.
We take our last question on the filibuster.
Hello, my name is Josh Kopenbarger and I'm from Illinois. And my question is, for senators, are there political risks while you're in a filibuster?
Sure. You can be labeled as an obstructionist. People do often want to see things get done if they think that the obstruction is purposeless or merely for the purpose of obstruction, and they do not see a broader good to come from it, so it's obstruction for the sake of obstruction, then I think that can be very risky. And people do not want to be labeled as obstructionists. So there's a fine line to be drawn there.
I saw it with Jim Bunning. Jim Bunning, who was elected he was a Baseball Hall of Fame. He just recently filibustered a bill. And this was one that had to do with, he was holding up actually unemployment continuation, and jobs were involved in that too. He became very unpopular, pictures in every newspaper, and he finally relented. He got a little bit of what he wanted in terms of, he was thinking of the fiscal situation and how this was going to upset it. But so that's a very recent example where somebody didn't look good to the country because of filibustering.
All right, why don't we move on to our last subtopic, which is just about our founding fathers' vision and how they originally created these bodies, but how they are today.
Hello, my name is Andrea Headley, and I'm from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. My question is, what is the exact purpose that the founding fathers made the House and Senate different?
Well, I mean, okay, so the founding fathers wanted representative government. And then they had their problem about how do we do this? Because big states said, oh, great, we do it by population. Small states said, I mean, come on, we need some equal representation. And so it became called the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise, where they decided, and it made a great deal of sense, where they decided, hey, we'll do a little bit of both. We'll make everybody happy. We'll do, the House of Representatives will be according to population, and the Senate will be a certain number of each state, which ended up being 2. And with the, and as Martin mentioned earlier, with the Senate, they were appointed. I always say, see how important they were? They were appointed. They weren't elected from the people. That's why the House is called the People's House. And as a matter of fact, Alexander Hamilton is mentioned in the House chamber with a statement, here, sir, he could have said madame also, here, sir, the people govern. And so that was the concept of being as direct with the people as possible. Unfortunately, they got 2-year terms, which allowed them to be close to the people. I mean, those farmers could be close to their folks, back home and whatever, and they wouldn't be there too long. I think it should be changed to 4 years. I don't think it will be, because the Senate will never agree, because it'd be a possibility somebody could be in the House and not lose the seat and run for the Senate, and win. But I think it would be more equitable if that were the case. Then now, and I'll let Martin make some comments on it, but now the number in the House of Representatives will stay 435. It used to vacillate, and I think now an average congressional district is about 693,000. It varies, of course. In some states only have 1 representative, and might not even have 693,000 people. But census is coming, so make sure that your families, and you, if you're living away from home, fill out that census form, because from the census comes redistricting for your congressional seats. And so it's very important that you fill that out.
I just add a word about that Connecticut Compromise. In order to have a new constitution in Philadelphia in 1789, you had to have 9 of the 13 states agree, 3/4 in other words, or otherwise you wouldn't have a new constitution. So the United States had an unworkable form of government under the Articles of Confederation, but there wasn't agreement on what a new form of government might look like. To get agreement from 9 out of 13 states, you had to do something about the small states, or the small states would never agree to cede the kind of power that they had to a federal government dominated by big states. They had to have some place where they could feel represented. And that's the Senate. That's why the Senate today, for instance, is a much more rural-dominated institution. The big cities have lots of power in the House of Representatives. But in the Senate, you start looking at the committee chairs and all the rest of it and see where they come from. Montana, for example, for the Senate Finance Committee, Max Baucus is the chairman. The ranking minority member on the committee, Chuck Grassley from Iowa. You've got that kind of power in the Senate because the Senate is a rural-dominated institution all the way back to that constitutional compromise. So just to reaffirm this, I mean, the bodies have always served a very different purpose. It's sort of the genius of the American system to put all that together, I think.
I've even seen members of the House of Representatives who serve with me who go on into the Senate and they become different people.
All right, well, thank you to both of our guests very much. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I want to thank the students of the Congressional Youth Leadership Council for their excellent questions. And of course, I also want to thank Congressman Morella and Mr. Gold for their comments today. We really appreciate it. This webcast will be archived on the website of the Lou Frey Institute at loufrey.org and at the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress at usafmc.org. Our next webcast is on Wednesday, April 7th, and we'll be talking about the relationship between the legislative branch and the executive branch. We hope you will be able to join us then. Thank you very much. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.